Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about your colonial immigrant ancestors. I've been preparing for this for actually several weeks, and I amassed so much information that there is just not enough time to cover it all in the time that we have together today. But as I've been watching Who Do You Think You Are and seeing some of the things that they're discovering, it's been really exciting, especially this week with Trisha Yearwood, as we've looked at some of the things that she learned about her colonial ancestors. I've been trying to figure out how to condense it down, and so what we're going to do today is we're just going to kind of skim the surface. We're going to talk about three major settlements in the Americas following, in the 1600s mostly, and then we'll talk about some resources available to learn more about those ancestors who may be from that specific time period. Going forward in future episodes, we may have to dive deeper into each of those three areas so that you have more depth of resources available. There's just not enough time to cover a couple hundred years of history and a few thousand miles worth of coastline. So we'll do the best we can. Let's dive in. Let's start with a discussion about Jamestown. So Jamestown is in what we now consider Virginia, and a lot of this area, or some of this area, had been explored back as early as the 1580s, the 1590s. Roanoke Island, if you're familiar with that, was kind of a failed experiment. And so the first English settlers arrived in Jamestown in 1607. Interestingly enough, or sadly enough, only 61 of the 500 original settlers there survived. So it was not an easy thing. Most of the people that came on that expedition were English aristocrats and explorers. They were people with, some of them with titles. They had money to be able to undertake this exploration. Many of them just had an adventurous spirit. And so, they stuck it out, and more settlers came. By 1610, we start to see some Polish and Dutch colonists coming to the area, and then in 1619, the first Africans are brought here. So that's kind of the early stages of this particular area of this coastline of Virginia and parts of that region. They're going to just spread out from there then as time goes on. So that's the Jamestown colony and that area. The next major settlement was in New England, or what we call New England now. Of course, the Mayflower and the Pilgrims are probably one of the better known settlements. A lot of people consider it one of the first settlements, and as we showed you, it's not. But the Mayflower arrived in 1620 at Plymouth Rock with 102 passengers. Now, the difference, or one of the major differences between the Mayflower and the Plymouth settlement, the settlement of New England versus Jamestown, is that the majority of the passengers, not all of them, but the majority of the passengers on the Mayflower were separatists who were fleeing religious persecution. So they were people who had chosen to separate from the Church of England, and because of that, they could not remain in England because of the persecution that they were enduring because of those choices. Several of them had gone over to Holland and then had come back to England before sailing on the Mayflower to Plymouth. Not only that, there were a few people who were not part of those separatists. Most notably would be Stephen Hopkins. Stephen Hopkins had actually, a decade earlier or more, gone to Virginia. He had shipwrecked and had ended up going back to England. And so he was not part of this separatist group of religionists, but he came and aligned himself with them for the purposes of building this particular colony. Now, there's this kind of interesting thing that starts to happen from 1628 to 1640. That period is known as the Great Migration from England. There were 20,000 immigrants who came into this area, and we start to see some of these towns spring up as they come here. They landed first at Plymouth, but then we start to see things like Boston and Salem and Charlestown and some of these other communities start to form and develop over those 20-year period of time as 20,000 immigrants, again, most of them Puritans, coming into this area. And so what we start to see here is this huge influence, this huge religious influence that is also part of the government. So the governing of this area is also mostly Puritan. And so if your family comes from this area during that time period, those religious records are also tied in with the court records and the land records and all of that, because there were very blurry lines between the two. So that is New England. The third area of this singular coastline on the east coast of what's now the United States that was settled is the area of New Amsterdam being what we currently call New York, and then some of the surrounding Dutch settlements. There's some interesting history here. Actually, there's some fascinating history here. This is probably where I've spent the last week of my life, is entrenched in this history. In 1624, the first Dutch families arrived. Now, for about 10 or 12 years before that, there had been explorers, most notably Henry Hudson, who the Hudson River is named after. There had been explorers mapping the area. There had been trappers, there had been people trading with the natives who lived here already. But in 1624, those first Dutch families arrive to take possession of that territory for their government and to open trading posts. And they did really well, and they started to expand, and others came, not just Dutch, but what we start to see then are French Huguenots who are also fleeing religious persecution. I hope you're starting to see a trend here. The French Huguenots had been driven out of France. Some of them had been driven into the Netherlands, some into Germany because of their religious choices. And so these Dutch settlements here became a place where they could come and, again, practice their religion free from that persecution. And so from 1624 to 1654, we see not just Dutch families arriving, but a lot of, again, those French Huguenot families. And I'm probably saying that word wrong. But in 1654, we actually see the first Ashkenazic Jews arrive. And they are then followed by a large group of Sephardic Jews. Those Sephardic Jews, many of them, the Ashkenazic Jews received passports from the Dutch government so that they could come and settle in this area that was owned or claimed by the Dutch. The Sephardic Jews did not come with passports or permission of the government. Many of them had been living down in Brazil, and there was, again, some religious persecution that started to get stirred up, and so they came up to this Dutch colony so that they could practice their religion with that freedom. Now, during this time period, as more and more families are coming into the area, as the families that exist there are multiplying and growing and spreading out a little bit, we're seeing what we start to see is they start to spread out from some of these original colonies like New Amsterdam and New Haven, and then they start spreading down the coast of what we now consider New Jersey into some settlements there. And unfortunately, what happens is the English in the north and the Spanish in the south and the English just to the south of them there, they end up in a lot of wars. There's some major conflicts that occur, and by 1674, that's kind of the end of what we consider the Dutch settlements, because the English took over. New Amsterdam was renamed New York, and those families kind of get spread out a little bit. And then we start to see, as we look through our family histories, some intermarriage with a lot of the Dutch and the English. That hadn't happened so much before that, again, because they were kind of isolated. But as the populations begin to grow and people begin to intermingle, we start to see some of that intermarriage, and then all sorts of craziness happens. So that is just a brief overview. Like I said, we could spend days on each one of these. That is just a brief overview of the three major settlements along the east coast of the United States. Now, I don't want to discount that there were natives that already lived here in the tens of thousands, that the Spanish government owned Florida and parts of that area and had settled that as well. The French also had large portions of land, particularly up in what we now consider Canada, and that stretched down through the Great Lakes region. But these are the three, what we consider the three major colonial settlements that lend to the majority of people who have what they consider colonial immigrant ancestors come from one of these three colonies, or in the case of some of us, from multiple of these colonies. So let's spend the last part of our time together here today just talking about some search tips, and then I'll show you some records and some things that you can, some other things you can do to learn more. The first search tip, and this may not feel like a search tip to you, but stick with me. The first search tip that I would give you is to learn more about the history of the area. You can do something as simple as Google the Great Migration or New Amsterdam. My family actually settled in what's now considered the Flatbush area of Brooklyn back in the 1600s as Dutch settlers, and as some French Huguenot families there as well. And so Google that. Learn about the history of the area. Don't just read Wikipedia articles, but when you look at a Wikipedia article, which seems to always be the first thing that comes up in a Google search, scroll down to the bottom and look at some of those references. So for example here, if I go, I'm just going to go to Google here, just to show you how I would do that. Let's see, New Amsterdam. And I'm going to Google that, and you'll see, again here, the Wikipedia article, for some reason, is almost always the first thing that comes up. So you can see they have maps, they have history, there's information about the early settlers. Read that, get familiar with it, understand what was going on, but then scroll down to the very bottom, and you see a few things. First, you see the references or the sources for the information in that article. Many times, these are clickable links. Sometimes they just click you through to a reference about a book, but sometimes there are articles that are written, sometimes there are other websites. For example, this one I love, the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, right? Excellent stuff there. I've spent time with several of these links lately. The History of Harlem. There's just some really cool things. Links to the British Library, other maps. I'm a map junkie. If I can visualize, and I did this last night, I spent probably 45 minutes looking through maps of the evolution of Manhattan Island from the time that the earliest settlers were there when it was called New Amsterdam. And you can start to get this visual concept of how things work. So always check the notes. If you read a Wikipedia article, always check the notes to see what other history or other links there are available. And then just below that, very often you're going to find a section called Further Reading. What this is it's just links to books that are usually, some of them are novels. So for example, this bottom reference here, I don't know if you can see that if I make it a little bit bigger for you. This bottom one here is actually a novel. Some of them are academic references. In this case, this is from the English Historical Review. You can see here that this one's been published by the Cambridge University Press, this one by the Museum of the City of New York. So look to see who not just what the title of the book is or who the author is, but who the publisher is. That'll tell you something about what the book is or what it might help you learn. Now, I tell you this because your ancestor specifically might not be listed in one of these works, but understanding more about the history of the time and the place, why people were coming there, what the circumstances were that they lived under and worked under and worshipped under, what the circumstances were that surrounded their choices of government and their choices of expansion. All of that helps you understand your ancestors a little bit better. It gives life to the stories of their lives. And you never know, you might get lucky and find something about them specifically. So there's a notes section, a further reading section, and then there is also almost always at the very bottom an external links section, which just gives you further links to information or websites about those locations. So in this case, there's a New Amsterdam Trail, which is a walking tour in Lower Manhattan. There's an audio history from the National Park Service, and then there is this thing called New Amsterdam, which is part of the New Netherland Project, which provides additional information about some of the settlers, some of those original settlers. So Google, learn more about the history of the area. If you get to a Wikipedia article, that's great, but always check those notes, further reading, and external links at the bottom of the page and explore them a little bit. Now, don't just look for books on Wikipedia, because those are usually going to be more history related or social history related. When we start talking about genealogy, there are going to be books about the early settlers and their families. If you talk about just the 20,000 people who immigrated to New England as part of the Great Migration, every single one of those 20,000 families has had books written about them. They have had, family histories written about them or local histories written about them. And on Ancestry.com, we have most of those books. So let me show you the fastest way to find those. If you hover over search, go down and click on card catalog, that will take you to the card catalog for Ancestry.com. If you're not familiar with it, it's just a listing of all of the databases that we have on our website. Scroll down over here on the left-hand side to look at these filters, and one of the filters over here that you probably have used less than any other is the one called Stories, Memories, and Histories. I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and let me just point out something with just that one click. Ancestry.com has 31,000 databases, a little bit over, on our website. 23,000 of those are part of this Stories, Memories, and Histories category. So it's not the major databases like censuses or passenger lists or things like that that you might expect to use or that you do use in a lot of your research. These are a little bit more personal and oftentimes a little bit smaller. You don't often have the giant databases. You end up with a lot more smaller databases, things that have, 10, 20, 30,000 records in it, maybe even just 100 or 200,000 records in it. What that means is those smaller databases don't have as much significance when you're doing a search. So they might not show up at the top of your search results. So sometimes they're going to be buried way down in your search results. So this is the fastest, easiest way to get to some of these things is by using the card catalog. So I have filtered down to Stories, Memories, and Histories, and then I have a couple different options here. I can filter then further by family histories, journals, and biographies, or social and place histories, or society and organization histories. So for our purposes today, we're gonna look at just two. Let's look first at this family histories, journals, and biographies. I'm gonna click that, and then I'm gonna click US and filter that list down a little bit further, and then I can filter it further by state if I want, or I can just explore this a little bit more. My family, let's see if I've done this correctly, my family, the last name is Lot. That's the Dutch family that came to New Amsterdam and then went out to Flatbush and then ended up down in Somerset County, New Jersey. And I know a little bit about them, but I don't know a lot about them. And so here, by just filtering down to some of these family histories, there is a book here called The Lot Family in America. And I can come here and I can do a search in that book for my family members, Or I can just click over here on this browse this collection box, and I can read this book just like I would any other book. Just go page by page. So if I zoom out here a little bit, here it looks like is a retired U.S. Army general who is part of the family. Somehow he ended up with a picture at the front of the book. Right down here in the bottom center of your image viewer, do you see how you have arrows? So you can just click on the arrow and go page by page through this book, and you can use your zoom feature to zoom in or zoom out. If you want to jump to a specific page in the book, you can just click on this number right here. So I'm on page 4 of 188. I can click on that number right there, and I can type in whatever number I want, hit enter, and it jumps me to that particular page in the book. Using these books are terrific resources. You'll see this particular book, they've got footnotes, they've got sources, the information has been documented about the family, and it looks like if I go back to, let's go back to my record here. If I read through the table of contents, there is a history of the origin of the Lott family in America, and then it goes from the first generation to the 9th generation. That's pretty great information, especially when you consider that I am only in the 11th generation. I think, if I did my math correctly, I'm in the 11th generation of this family. So theoretically, if I were to look at this chapter about the 9th generation of this family, my grandmother should be listed there. If she's not, they may not have known about that particular branch of the family. I just worked my way back up through each chapter until I find a relative that I know about, and then follow the documentation in this book to determine how I am, or if I am, connected to the particular family being mentioned here in this book. Again, we have thousands of these books online. The family history section, just type in a last name and see what comes up that might be a book about your family. Now, all of these books, we indexed them by OCR. What that means is a computer read the page to index the page, which is great because it means we can index thousands of things very, very quickly. However, one of the problems is this. If you look at one of these images, let's find one with lots of words. Scroll out a little bit. You'll notice that the page is skewed a little bit, meaning it was typed, the original was typed, it looks like back in 1942, and the typewriting goes down on the page, and so it's skewed just a little bit. That creates some problems for OCR. You'll also notice that if I zoom in right here on this word, there's a couple of things you may notice. There's what we call noise on the image, or a little bit of blurriness or fading. That causes some problems sometimes. Also, and this happens in old books all of the time, sometimes people break words at weird places. In this case, they actually broke it at a syllable and put a hyphen, which is technically what you're supposed to do. But I've seen books where they break words in very odd places. And if the word that they broke was Phillips, if you were doing a search for Phillips, you wouldn't find it this way through just a traditional search. So just a couple things to be aware of when you're searching these books. You can search them. You can come over here and say, you know what, show me everybody named Cornelius who's mentioned in this book. And there's 35 search results, and I can go through and I can look at each one of those. But there's a lot that you would miss, a lot of really rich history, a lot of information, and maybe even some references to your ancestor, depending on how well that OCR came through. So just some things to be aware of as you're working with these books. Those are our family histories. The other thing that I would like to point out to you or make you aware of in this same stories, memories, and histories category are what we call social and place histories. So let me clear this because I've got my lot name in there. We're going to go back to stories, memories, and histories. We're going to go to social and place histories. And I mentioned that Lott family migrated their way down to Somerset County, New Jersey. So I'm just going to come here with my filters, and I'm going to come down to New Jersey, and then it's going to show me a list of counties, and I'm going to come down to Somerset County, and it looks like there are 54 place histories that are related somehow to Somerset County. And they're all sorts of different things. And just spend some time exploring this. There's so much rich information here that I think gets missed so often because either you don't know it exists, or like I said, it's so far down in your search results, and because of the OCR technology or the way in which it's been indexed, just makes it a little bit more challenging. But if you can explore it, just like you would a library bookshelf, and find a book that interests you, then you might be really surprised at what you discover. So for example, this is a book called North of the Raritan Lots, A History of the Martinsville, New Jersey area. Well, I know that the family settled in Raritan, and their last name is Lott. And so this book, even though it's categorized as a place history, because it is a history of this particular area of New Jersey, very likely will include information about my family. Here's another one, and this book I actually was looking at last night. This is a historical discourse on occasion of the centennial anniversary of the Reformed Dutch Church of Millstone. How's that for a mouthful? This book, actually, I looked at it, like I said last night, it contains information about my family who were part of that Reformed Dutch Church of Millstone. It contains information about my 9th, 10th great-grandfather, who was the sheriff of Somerset County during the Revolutionary War, and money that the different people in the community gave him to maintain the courthouse, to rebuild his home after the British burned it down. All of this is information that is just buried, gold, that is buried in some of these little books that have been published and placed online. So spend some time looking for books about your early settlers and their families, and do it by either family name or by location. My final tip for you today is just be aware that spelling, I mean, you've worked with census records from 1940 even, but certainly through 1880, 1870, where spelling is oftentimes inconsistent. And usually that was because the census taker may have had a different accent than the family who was providing the information, or somebody didn't know how to spell something exactly correctly, or the handwriting was so sloppy that it got indexed incorrectly. Lots of reasons. But intentionally, spelling gets more, well, not intentionally, but it happens. Spelling becomes more inconsistent the further back that you go. So, for example, this Lott family of mine, my great-grandfather was married to a woman whose last name was Brokaw, just like Tom Brokaw. As a matter of fact, he's my grandmother's 6th cousin. So Brokaw, B-R-O-K-A-W. However, her grandfather spelled it B-R-O-U-C-A-R-D. And the family that stayed in New Amsterdam that didn't migrate down to New Jersey spelled it B-R-O-G-A-W. So lots of different spellings. And so don't do too many exact searches without reading through some of those books and looking for some of those spelling variations that may have changed over time, especially as some of these new immigrants came into this country. You'll see very often that the name that they used in the old country morphs slowly over time until you end up with a group of first cousins who might be using 4 different spellings of their last name. So just be aware of that as you do your searches. There's so much information to cover and never enough time to cover it all, but hopefully this has given you a taste for where you might find some more information about those immigrant ancestors, particularly during that colonial period, why they came over, how they spread up and down the East Coast, and then eventually that westward expansion as we became the United States over the course of the next century. If you have any questions, I will be on chat immediately following this presentation if you're watching it live, so feel free to stick around and I'll be there in just a few minutes. If you're watching an archived version of this on our YouTube channel, just leave a comment in the comment section, and I do monitor those and will answer those as necessary. If you have suggestions for further topics that you'd like to see addressed on our show, please email me at ask@ancestry.com if you want to include a little bit of information about your specific research question or challenge. That just just helps me to direct these presentations a little bit better and make them a little bit more personal. You can see the full list of our presentations on our Facebook page and click on the events tab there to RSVP for the topics of interest to you. And then, as always, you can watch all archived past presentations on our YouTube channel at the URL there on your screen. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.